We're today looking at John chapter 13 and verses 18 to 30. This is the place where Jesus predicts his betrayal by Judas. I'm reading from verse 18. I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen. But this is to fulfill the scripture, he who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. I tell you the truth. Whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. And after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at each other, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to the disciple and said, Ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. And then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. What you're about to do quickly, Jesus told him. But no one at the meal understood what Jesus said, why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charges of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the feast or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Now, the passage starts in the middle of a scene of action here. It says, I'm not referring to all of you, I have known those I have chosen. And when he says, I'm not referring to all of you, he's referring back to the previous section. So let me just read what had taken place. Remember, this is when Jesus had washed his disciples' feet, and they were quite astounded at this act. And in fact, some of them were resentful of the idea that he, being Lord and Master, should take the role of a servant. But when he had finished washing their feet, it says in verse 12, he put on his clothes and returned to his place and said, Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done to you. I tell you the truth. No servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. And then he goes on to say, but I'm not referring to all of you. In other words, he's saying that you are not all of my servants. You are not all those who have taken on the role that I have given to you. I've set you an example so that you should do what I have done for you. But, he says, I'm not referring to all of you, because there's one amongst you who is not of you. And although I know, and the reason I know that is because I have chosen the individual themselves. Now, that's an important point for us. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill the scripture. He who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Now, this idea of I know those whom I have chosen indicates that Jesus is referring to the 11 disciples whom he's chosen to be his followers and to take forward his ministry and to be the creators of the church. But the implication also, it seems to me, is that he's also chosen Judas, and he knows the kind of character that he's chosen to be a member of the 12, and knew it from the start, and chose Judas for this particular purpose, a purpose which was written about way, way long ago, back in the time of David, 1,000 years previously. The psalmist who wrote in one particular psalm that He who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me. That's written in Psalm 41 and verse 9. And it's well worthwhile just looking at that particular psalm in its context to see how that works out. Let me read to you from verse 4 of Psalm 41. I said, O Lord, have mercy on me, heal me, for I have sinned against you. My enemies say of me in malice, when will he die and his name perish? Whenever one comes to see me, he speaks falsely, while his heart gathers slander. Then he goes out and spreads it abroad. All my enemies whisper together against me. They imagine the worst for me, saying a vile disease has beset him, and he will never get up from the place where he lies. Even my close friend, whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And that's the verse which Jesus is referring to here. He knows the Psalms intimately, and he obviously sees Psalm 41 here as being representative of his situation and his case. And that's interesting because looking at Psalm 41, I suppose from the beginning, blessed is he who has regard for the weak is the very first verse. The Lord delivers him in times of trouble. And that this psalm echoes, first of all, the Beatitudes, where Jesus expands on that. Blessed he who is has regard for the weak, which is a kind of meekness. Blessed are those who are meek. And this whole psalm, therefore, could be considered a messianic psalm. It's a psalm which speaks to Jesus of himself and of his own role and of his own ministry. And the idea that he has enemies who are malicious, that are looking for his death and his name to perish. They speak falsely about him. They gather slander. They tell false reports. They spread it abroad. The enemies whisper against him. They say that he is rotten, evil, and sinful, and that he'll never get up from where he is, and that even his close friend whom he trusted, he who shares my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And one can imagine that Jesus would read these psalms and think very deeply about their meaning for him personally, that this spoke directly of his particular condition, because it was written about him right from the very start. And when he says that it was written here that this is to fulfill the scriptures, he who shares my bread has lifted up his heel against me, I understand that to mean the entire psalm is something which is being enacted out in my life. The whole of the passage refers to me. The whole psalm itself is something which is directed towards me, and I see myself reflected within it. And therefore, this particular element, someone who shares his bread with me, is someone who has lifted up his heel against me. Talking about betrayal. And coming back then to the idea that Jesus says he has chosen. I know those who I have chosen. He also, therefore, chose Judas, and he knows him as well. Knows his character and his flaws, knows his desire for money and worldly things, and yet he welcomed him in as a disciple and allowed him to flourish and to learn from all the same things which all the other disciples learned from, and to gain from that. And yet, knowing his character, knowing that he would not accept the teachings of Christ in a way which would change his heart and mind. And knowing all that beforehand is quite a remarkable and astonishing thing. Because here you have the idea that Judas was chosen for the characteristics of allowing him in to the discipleship's inner circle, providing him with all of the benefits of that discipleship, the close acquaintance with Jesus and his teaching, and yet also knowing that that would not be receptive or accepted by him, and yet choosing him anyway, quite deliberately, in order that the prophecy or the Psalm 41 would be fully enacted out. This shows an incredible degree of knowledge, not only of the scriptures, an incredible degree of presence, and an incredible understanding of the workings out of history and incorporating it into your own decision-making, something which Jesus seems to have done right from the very start. In other words, he never made this up as he went along. He knew exactly what the plans were, as if a perfect blueprint had been laid out for him. Everything was planned to perfection. There's an astonishing degree of planning here. When you look at all the tiny little details, this is one of them. The choosing of Judas and the dipping of the bread into the bowl is something which is significant from that verse. The choosing of the donkey to come into town, and many, many other instances, all carefully planned beforehand by Jesus himself, which meant that he had a very full and complete knowledge of the entirety of his mission, even before he started. It wasn't something which developed on the way along and changed as circumstances changed. It was executed according to a complete and perfect plan. And Jesus chose Judas as part of that plan. And when he said, he who shares this bread has lifted up his heel against me, it was interesting that later on in that verse, when the disciple asked him, which one of you is going to betray you, he leans back against Jesus and says, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Quite literally, he is sharing the bread and quite literally invoking that prophecy and invoking that psalm by the very act of identifying Judas, by dipping the bread into the sauce or whatever it was that was there and handing it directly to Judas. That was in direct fulfillment of Psalm 41. All of that is quite remarkable in the way it was carefully planned out. Let's go back to verse 19. I'm telling you all this now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. Now that was very important, because when he says, when it does happen, you will believe that I am he, what's he referring to when it does happen? He's talking about the betrayal. When the betrayal happens, you will understand that I am he. When I am tried, you will understand that I am he. When I am crucified and killed, you will understand that I am he. And also, when I am resurrected, you will also understand that I am he. In other words, you must not see my betrayal and my trial and vilification and crucifixion as something which stops you from understanding who I am. Rather, because I have told you beforehand what to expect, you should be well prepared for that event. And here you see something of the compassion of Jesus, insofar as preparing his disciples for these events is something which he took great care to do. And on many occasions he explained to them how the Son of Man must be killed and rise again on the third day. And yet they seemed unable to understand what he was saying. But he tells them that beforehand so that you'll believe that I am he, and not cause to doubt, not have a crisis of faith when I am taken and crucified. I tell you the truth, whoever accepts anyone that I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. Who is the one who he is sending? Well, I think it's referring here to the disciples. I will be sending you, and in fact you have a commission. There's a great commission in Matthew 28. At the end, go out into all the world and preach the gospel. Whoever, it says, whoever accepts anyone I send, accepts me. So here we are, we're on the cusp. We're on the changing point. My ministry is coming to an end, and your ministry is about to begin. You have been tutored and nursed in the scriptures and in an understanding of God and his will by me for 3 years. That is coming to an end. And what will happen now is your ministry will begin and start. And those who I send, if they accept you, they accept me. In other words, you will have the same authority and carry the same message and be the equivalent of me even after I am gone. And if you accept, they accept you, they accept me. And if they accept me, they accept the one who sent me, which is the Father. So there's a strong link and line. And the way in which Jesus has sent out the disciples is the same way in which the Father has sent out the Son. The connection there is unbreakable, and the connection is one of purpose, design, and knowledge, all of the Word of God, carried through that line from the Father to the Son to the disciples who become apostles when they are sent out. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me." He became troubled in spirit. And I think that's an understandable thing, to become troubled at that point, because that is the point at which we're looking at the close of Jesus' ministry and the start of the disciples' ministry. A transition, a change. Something is going to happen here which will bring his earthly life to an end and their public ministry to a commencement. And that is something which Jesus finds troubling, because the transition is going to be painful, difficult, and culminating in his crucifixion and death by one of the most painful methods which human beings have devised. He became troubled in spirit, and one can understand that's a foretaste of the troubling spirit which afflicted him in the Garden of Gethsemane, which we'll see shortly. But as he said this, he became troubled in spirit, and that spirit testified, he said, to the one who is going to betray me. So he was quite explicit about this. His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them said, the one who said to the one whom Jesus loved, which is John himself, the one who writes this. He writes in a kind of third person, doesn't like to proclaim himself to be that. There's a kind of modesty here which is being presented. And Simon Peter, and he said he was reclining next to him, which shows the closeness that he has to Jesus. Simon Peter mentioned to the disciple and said, ask him which one he means, which means that you're closest to him. You could ask him that kind of thing, which maybe I couldn't ask. And so he does, and he dips the bread in the bowl and gives it to Judas Iscariot. And as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. What you're about to do, do quickly. A line which Shakespeare picks up elsewhere. If it was best done, do it quickly, from Macbeth. And Jesus told him, do that quickly, but no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Despite the fact that he just said he was going to be betrayed, they didn't link that with Judas, but Judas gets up and goes out. But since Judas had charge of the money, some thought that Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the feast. The feast, of course, was for the Sabbath, which was the Saturday, the day after the Friday. And although this is the Last Supper, this was the closest they would get to the Paschal feast and lamb, which was a Thursday night, because Friday would be the day when Jesus was offered up as a sacrifice, and Sunday would be the time when nothing took place except the feast. And so they thought that Judas would go out and buy something for the feast on the Sabbath, or go and give something to the poor. But they were still completely unaware of what the situation was about. And as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out and it was night. Not sure why we're told it was night, other than to say this was a late time of the day. We're in April, of course, of the year, and night time would occur any time after about 8 o'clock. So it could have been about 9 o'clock that Judas went out. We can't be too sure about the time, but it's getting rather late. Judas goes out at 9 o'clock, and he goes to the house of the high priests, ready to say that Jesus is ready to be betrayed. And at this point, Jesus then starts talking to his disciples about and preparing the way for his arrest and death later on that evening.